So this video recaps the main reasons why crimes are regarded as serious in the early modern era. So that's 1500 to 1750. And one of the key things to remember in this era is there are big advancements in lots of different areas. So we've got growth in towns and population. And where we haven't necessarily looked at the crime as perhaps serious in medieval times, there'll be a quick recap to remind you of how it was seen in medieval times. So moving on then to think about our key reasons why crimes are taken seriously. So the first thing we need to think about is the religious conflict started by Henry VIII. Now in medieval times there have been the church courts and there have been the king's courts, which were the state's courts. And if you were tried in the king's courts, things generally tended to be much harsher for you. Now Henry played Catholics and Protestants off against one another. He had children of different religions, which meant that when they became the king or queen, they obviously felt threatened and their power threatened by members of the other religion, and felt the need to persecute them as well, which we will then see with Elizabeth I, James I, and the Gunpowder Plotters. Now, another reason that crimes are taken seriously is that the traditional method of looking after the poor was gotten rid of when Henry made his religious changes. The monasteries had looked after the poor. They'd given them alms, they'd given them looking after them when they were sick, they'd given them clothes, there were perhaps jobs on the monastery's land as well. These were all gone. So there was an increase in the numbers of poor wandering the country looking for jobs. There's also a population growth and the towns increase as well, which means there's more opportunity for crime. But also Henry loves to spend money and he loves war. He's always at war with the French. So he needs to pay, he needs tax to be able to pay to build ships, etc., to defend his country from his perhaps being attacked by his religious changes, but also perhaps to take advantage and fight in France. And he often takes money in, takes gold out and silver out and mixes it with a lesser metal. Now this makes the coinage worth less money, which means that prices are then put up by shopkeepers because they want the same amount of money for their goods or the same worth for their goods. This is called inflation. And this makes it really difficult for the poor, which then leads to more crime. Another reason why crimes are taken seriously again at this time are obviously the landowners also looking to make more money. Now, growing vegetables is no longer, so arable farming is no longer that profitable in Tudor times. So wool farming, sheep farming is worth much more. And the poor had often worked on the land, been given a house as part of their wages. Now they're kicked out of these houses when they're no longer needed, and therefore that creates a lot of homeless people, which leads to our first crime, which is vagrancy. Okay, so we need to think about what a vagabond is and why they're actually seen as so threatening to Henry VIII. Now, in our medieval times, as a very quick recap, we can see that there were still homeless people, but there were less homeless people. The Statute of Labourers meant that this was a law to stop people wandering after the Black Death. So people were imprisoned, whipped, and put in the stocks or beaten. And this is to set an example, not to do it to deter them. This is corporal punishment. Okay, they will be probably turned to crime, they feel, as it's really difficult to find work at the time. So, thinking about our early modern era then. Now, these are seen as a real threat to the power of the monarch because you can't necessarily tie someone down and get tax out someone that's wandering the country. But the wealthy see these as potential criminals. They see people as born with a flaw of idleness and that they are perhaps sturdy beggars. People who are fit and able to work but wander the streets for a living instead, so they choose to do that. So other reasons why they're perhaps such a threat is that they are a lot of ex-soldiers and they might rise up in rebellion, or they may well be spreading the plague across the country. So this also increases or is a time when there's an increased ability for people to read and write. So literacy has improved. So the government is able to print pamphlets to warn people of the dangers of these sturdy beggars, giving them categories such as the drummerer, so as we know, people who pretend to be deaf or mute, or priggers of prancers, people who have stolen horses. And they introduced lots of harsh laws. So in 1547, there's a harsh vagrancy act. Anyone out of work for more than 3 days is branded with a V and then sold as a slave for 2 years. Now, people aren't really keen to carry this out, and perhaps it's more of a reaction to the fact that Edward is made king at 9 years old, and he needs to stamp his authority onto the country. In 1597, whipping and burning the ear with hot iron is what would happen if you were caught as a vagabond or a vagrant. And in 1601, it slightly eases. All local parishes are to provide poor relief to anyone who's deserving poor, e.g. the elderly or disabled. So this should hopefully reduce those wandering the countryside. Now, the undeserving poor, or the sturdy beggars, are branded and sent to the recently opened houses of correction. So this is where we see a long-term shift in attitudes towards the poor that carries on all the way through our eras until the 20th century, where actually it's the poor that are choosing poverty over work. They are idle and they are lazy, and this is very much an attitude in our Victorian England as well. Right, so moving on to the king with two serious crimes that we need to look at, James I. Here we see religion being a key reason why both the Gunpowder Plot happened and why witchcraft becomes a more serious crime at this time. So moving on to the Gunpowder Plot then. So to revise the event, you can actually watch the documentary again. You can look at your notes and you can use the pages of the textbook, pages 58 to 60. But the most important detail for us to remember about this crime and why it's serious is it's obviously threatening the power of the king, and it is motivated by those religious differences between Catholics and Protestants set up by Henry VIII. So this, obviously, Henry VIII was Catholic. He supported the Protestants. Then he moved back over towards the Catholic faith and supporting the Catholics towards the end of his life. His son Edward is Protestant. His daughter Mary is then Catholic. Elizabeth is then Protestant. And she was kind of accepting of Catholics as long as you weren't open about it, until there are a few plots against her life and she starts to become quite harsh to the Catholics. So Catholics have had a lot of change, and this king comes in, James I, who is advised by Puritans, and obviously they are extreme Protestants, so quite different to the way Catholics worship and like to live their lives. So our big consequence from this Gunpowder Plot, really, whilst they threaten the power of the king or the queen, is actually that it changes the way that Catholics are treated for a long time. So this sees them restricted from many areas of life. In fact, the heir to the throne today still cannot marry a Catholic. So they're restricted from voting, from being MPs, from owning land. They're banned from voting in elections. So basically any way of helping to govern the country. But obviously now they're kind of restricted from marrying the heir to the throne. Okay, so thinking about witchcraft then, this is also similar, perhaps to medieval times. So those people who made herbal remedies were seen as good witches, and then they introduced this idea of bad witches, people that perhaps are trying to spread the work of Satan on earth and cause problems on earth. And these tend to be vulnerable older women in communities who are used as scapegoats to explain the unexplainable. Now, when Henry VIII takes over, the church crimes formerly tried in church courts, such as witchcraft, become a state crime. Punishments are being burned at the stake to purify your soul, and rulers such as Elizabeth I only punish someone if you've actually been hurt. But James I is really influenced by the Puritans, the extreme Protestants who believe that Satan is always trying to cause problems. So he firmly believes in witches, and in his reign we see poor vulnerable women targeted. He writes a book called Demonology and tries witches, big crimes, because he felt that he was caught in a storm and this was all created by witches. Now there's supposedly a great group of women, Berwick witches, that were causing major problems in the north of England, in his opinion, and they had very famous trials. But moving through the rulers, there's a lot of chaos due to the English Civil War. An opportunist called Matthew Hopkins appears. Now we know him as the Witchfinder General, and he plays on people's fears, particularly in Essex. So he claims he's found the devil's book, citing who witches are, and he's paid by communities to put witches on trial. So this gets him a lot of money, and other people start to do that as well. But he's also helped by the invention of the printing press, because obviously it's easy then to spread the stories across the country, which creates more fear. People then demand that their local governments and the king take it seriously, and they do something about it. Now, this witchcraft being seen as serious as a crime only really dies down with Charles II, and the greatest investment that there is into scientific research, which can now start explaining the unexplainable. So as we move away from the monarchs being powerful, the government obviously then increases in their power after our civil war. So it's really important to remember that the government is made up of wealthy aristocratic landowners, so they still see these things as challenges to their power. So where we had power of the monarch before, it's now a challenge to the government. But we do see a change in the crimes that are taken seriously, because now it's threatening our aristocratic landowners. So our government needs to raise tax to go to war. So they put a high tax on alcohol, tea, sugars, and other kind of goods that can be hard to detect if they're smuggled in. Farm labourers, members of the Navy, earn such small wages that it's easy for gangs to develop, and they can get workers pretty easy. Networks can develop where they can smuggle in goods on the coast and they can send it through taverns to the towns and the cities and be sold off quickly. So customs officials can sometimes be killed, as the government took it so serious that anyone caught would be hung, and this is called capital punishment. But obviously the local people don't want that to happen, and they might actually end up killing a customs official rather than have the gang members or their local community. So a similar crime that becomes more serious is poaching. So we remember it from medieval times with the forest laws, and again this is a threat to the landowners' power, who are in government, so they're the ones making the laws. So they started in the Industrial Revolution era, and obviously a bit before, to fence off large areas of land, to create parklands around their houses, create country estates. And this had been former common lands where ordinary people could forage for food, graze their animals, and do the general things of kind of boosting up their income. Now, this became a serious crime, as poaching is now punishable by death, so capital punishment. And people see this really as a social crime. Again, it had been their right, so it wasn't really a crime. And gangs poach together because it's easier to get around gamekeepers as well at the time. So we can see landowners' power being the kind of big motivation for this being seen as a serious crime. So in summary then, we can see lots of continuity between the medieval and the early modern era. But depending upon the ruler and what they saw as a threat to their personal power, depends on what becomes more serious. And obviously with scientific advancements, things that perhaps have been a crime before are now no longer a crime, because clearly there is a very clear explanation for it. But treason remains the same. Vagrancy is a new one for us, really. Witchcraft, and that obviously disappears by the end of this era. Robbery, kidnap, rape, extortion of money, those kinds of things still carried on, still would be seen as crimes. Theft, arson, vandalism again, but poaching becomes more serious again in our crimes against property.